Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming today. My name's Alex Nichol. I'm a senior fellow here, and we're here today to discuss Myanmar. And I think it's going to be a very interesting subject to talk about. Of course, when a country begins to reform and open up, as Myanmar has, there are bound to be challenges, huge challenges deriving from its complex history and the legacy of the previous regime and so forth. And what we're going to talk about today is a prime example, I think, of those kinds of challenges. And to discuss them, we have our own research associate, Hervé Lemahieu, who has worked on Burma for quite a long time. In fact, he spent a considerable part of his youth there, and then also worked in development, actually in the area that we're talking about today, and then proceeded in his career to work for Oxford Analytica, where he was a Middle East analyst. Southeast Asia analyst, again focusing on this particular region. So very much looking forward to what he has to say. Hervé, over to you.
Great, thanks Alex, thanks very much. So I think we're here to discuss some of the we've heard much about the Myanmar's political transition over the last 5 years. We are in a very critical year. There are elections coming up which would be or stand a good chance of being the first free and fair elections in quite some time. But at the same time, we've had lots of issues relating to violence in the border areas. There are still ethnic armed groups, 16 major ethnic armed groups operating and in some form of negotiation or confrontation with the government. And this one in particular, the Kokang, affects what is essentially the most important bilateral relationship that Myanmar has, which is that with China. So it has a very complex history, but I'll try to break it down succinctly and get through my presentation so we can have some interesting questions and discussion to follow. So since February, there have been sustained clashes between government troops and what is known as the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance, the MNDAA, otherwise known as the Kokang, in northern Myanmar in Shan State. This has caused considerable intrigue and confusion for foreign observers. And it was essentially started in early February by Peng Xiaosheng, who is a deposed leader of the Kokang, who returned from exile in China and has led an incredibly well-orchestrated campaign of attacks on and around Lokai, which is the capital of the Kokang region. And I should mention the Kokang region is a autonomous zone which does not fall under the central doesn't fall under the central government control. This is essentially a very remote region. The fighting has resulted in one of the largest refugee crises on China's borders since the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War. It has displaced approximately 100,000 people, 60,000 of whom, according to China's state media, have crossed into southern Yunnan province. To complicate matters, Myanmar military airstrikes have strayed into Chinese territory just because this is a border area very close to Yunnan province. This has prompted China's Central Military Commission last month to warn of retaliatory measures against Myanmar. Meanwhile, Burmese counterparts in the Tatmadaw, or the Myanmar military, have accused China, or actually elements within China, of arming and training the Kokang army, the returned exiled faction of the Kokang army under Peng Xiaosheng. So it's the biggest challenge, I would argue, in the bilateral ties since President Thein Sein came to power. And even bigger, I would say, than that which followed the suspension in September 2011 of the $3.6 billion Myitsone Dam, which was a Chinese investment and was taken in the West, at least, as a symbolic move by President Thein Sein against overbearing Chinese influence. Domestic reforms in Naypyidaw have allowed the country to shed its image as a pariah state in the West, but the political transition has posed a particular challenge to Beijing. Chinese decision makers have found bilateral ties exposed to new political currents, including the normalization of Myanmar's external relations with many advanced countries in the West. In this sense, the border conflict is in itself a useful litmus test of where we stand after 5 years of nominally civilian rule in Myanmar. And I think even more interesting is the fact that this really pits together not simply a government against a government, but a military against a military, two very powerful establishments which occupy considerable policy space and have their own very proud narratives in their respective countries, and also have very historic strategic bonds with one another. So I think it's put into question really the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Beijing, and also what's known as the Bokfa or the kinship ties between the two military establishments. Border dynamics feed directly into mutual suspicions and a sense of strategic vulnerability in Beijing. Beijing's military posture reflects a deep ambivalence towards the political and security dynamics at work in Myanmar, as well as a fear that it has lost its relative influence in standing there amid the country's political transition. But I would argue that actually Chinese political dominance during military rule and its subsequent loss of influence since 2011 are too easily exaggerated. I see this conflict very much as part of a long-standing approach by Myanmar's military and subsequently its civilian rulers for embracing a non-aligned foreign and defense policy to manage a complex mix of political security challenges that the country has confronted since independence. National disintegration has historically served as the raison d'être for military rule, and Myanmar's foreign policy has always been an extension of this principle. And I think the Kokang incident is an excellent case in point. The flare-up is neither an unprecedented turning point in bilateral ties, nor necessarily a sign of a wider recalibration in regional geopolitics. I think developments in Kokang are, in the short term, unfavorable towards bilateral ties, but critically I think it has also meant or created an opportunity in which the military has exploited circumstances to generate two very key victories. One, I think ultimately this will result in the military proving that it can leverage its ties with Beijing. Myanmar's importance to Beijing for vital geoeconomic considerations significantly outweighs its interest in non-state armed groups and hinges, crucially, on cross-border stability. And second, the Tatmadaw has rallied domestic opinion in Myanmar for support of its unfinished and very messy business of state building. The losers in all this, I think, are the Kokang themselves, and Peng Xiaoxing in particular, who has clearly wanted to foment divisions between Myanmar and China. So I think we need to read more into this than simply the Kokang incident and the resulting tensions between Beijing and Naypyidaw as being a fallout or as a consequence of a foreign policy recalibration of Myanmar away from Beijing. It's far more complicated. So the Myanmar military retains long-held memories of proxy warfare. The Kokang in particular have long-standing cultural and business links with China, and Peng Xiaoxing himself, the Kokang leader, who is now an octogenarian warlord, traces his career back to the height of Myanmar's civil war as part of the Burma Communist Party, which was Chinese-backed. So I think this memory still lives on, even if it's not sufficiently recognized abroad. And the conflict stems from the final steps of the military's roadmap to democracy, which saw a renewed attempt to integrate more than a dozen ethnic armed groups under the 2008 constitution. This led to a breakdown in several ceasefires, including with the Kokang in 2009. After the Kokang under Peng Xiaoxing refused to become a border guard force, the Tatmadaw launched a brief offensive and forcibly subdued the Kokang leadership, which was driven into exile, along with an estimated 37,000 civilians. And what was left behind was a more compliant but still autonomous Kokang administration. That initial toppling of Peng Xiaoxing in 2009 was ironically done by a man called Min Aung Hlaing, who went on to become the commander-in-chief. He personally oversaw that offensive in 2009, and that was a crowning achievement which allowed him to become commander-in-chief. So again, the memories are there, and the ties to these issues are long-standing. Initially, I think Beijing had a very muted reaction, therefore, when 5 years later, on February 6th, or between February 6th and February 9th, Peng Xiaoxing launched an incursion back into Kokang to reclaim his territory. I mean, I think Beijing saw this as rather bothersome and awkward. It raised all sorts of uncomfortable questions, which it would rather have forgotten than raised to the surface. I mean, there was a meeting on February 5th, so simply, I mean, days before Peng's arrival back into Kokang, between the commander-in-chief, the Burmese commander-in-chief Min Aung Hlaing, and the special envoy for Myanmar on the Chinese side, Wang Yingfang. In that meeting, it seems as if the commander-in-chief had raised concerns that low-level defense personnel and other actors on the Chinese side had been allowed to make some unilateral decisions with regard to Myanmar. In other words, I think he was warning the Chinese that they better take control over local elements. And in fact, I mean, there are reasons to doubt that the Kokang invasion by Peng Xiaoxing was even that much of a surprise. Because in December 2014, in a now deleted interview in China's Global Times, Peng Xiaoxing himself had openly admitted to planning to retake the Kokang special region. He appealed to the common race and roots between the Kokang and the Han Chinese and alluded to a shared mission to confront the Myanmar military until we reclaim Kokang. That's a quote. I don't think this interview could have gone unnoticed in Naypyidaw, and certainly not in Beijing. And I think this also explains why, at the initial outbreak of hostilities, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China certainly called for calm and counseled against or prohibited any Chinese organizations or individuals using its territory to undermine Chinese-Myanmar relations. This is all sort of in the formal foreign policy speak of the Chinese MFA. But it's far from thinking that this is some kind of Crimea scenario in which the Chinese might have actually overtly supported an invading force into Kokang to leverage its influence in Myanmar. I actually think the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. It's inconceivable that Peng Xiaoxing didn't receive some form of local support. I think, logistically speaking, financially speaking, he would have required a local basis of support. But again, I think this highlights differences between the way that the border areas look from Beijing versus the way that they look from Kunming, so the capital city of Yunnan province. For Yunnan, these border areas are almost a back garden, and they're far more integrated into the Yunnanese economy than they are into the central Burmese economy. And it seems clear that Peng, in his pronouncements, was clearly hoping to foment divisions between China and Myanmar. And this is something that he built his career in, over decades. The timing of the intervention, promptly before the Chinese New Year, would have added pressure on Beijing to urge for quick solutions rather than support the Burmese military in a very protracted and destabilizing counteroffensive on its borders. And I think it would have hoped that the Tatmadaws' reaction was or would be restrained, but if anything, it was the opposite. On February 10th, the Burmese military launched airstrikes on more than a dozen sites of the Kokang army. And the military itself in Myanmar was able to tap into widespread nationalist sentiment and renew its image as the sort of pivotal actor required to prevent the disintegration of Myanmar, which sounds bizarre again, but I think psychologically speaking, again, appeals to the reason for why the military sees itself as being required in Myanmar to keep the country together from all these centripetal forces which are threatening to break away. So reports of at least 47 government troops killed defending national sovereignty while fighting off external and illegitimate, in the eyes of Myanmar, rebels, were received with sympathy in many parts of Burmese society. On February 12th, which is normally this is Union Day in Myanmar, the commander-in-chief made a show of the Kokang conflict, and mentioned that any groups that support the Kokang would have to pay for their actions. The Tatmadaw won rare praise, including on social media. You can see this by looking at the Facebook page, for example, of the Minister of Information, Yetut, who has a huge following of tens of thousands of people. And even President Thein Sein, who is normally known as a moderate, and whose government has really led this drive to build confidence with ethnic groups and to build a peace process, described Peng's fighters as a renegade and invading force, and declared that the army would not lose an inch of Myanmar territory. So in a way this was actually a propaganda coup, I would argue, in favor of the military. Viewed from Beijing, of course, the Tatmadaw's counteroffensives and the prospect of conflict spillover were seen as a direct threat to territorial integrity and to the stability of the border area. The border is 2,185 kilometers long and is seen as crucial by the Chinese. So airstrikes which strayed into Chinese territory, notably in an incident on the 13th of March which killed 5 Chinese farmers, really proved the tipping point in what was initially a very muted reaction on the Chinese side into something a lot more overtly critical of the Myanmar military. On March 15th, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang issued a public rebuke of the Myanmar military for incursions into territory. A day earlier, the Vice Chairman of China's Central Military Commission, Fan Changlong, warned that the PLA would take measures to protect the safety of Chinese people and assets. The Ministry of National Defense dispatched Air Force fighter jets to the conflict zone in order to track, warn, and chase away the Myanmar military aircraft. I think this response is partly the result of, as I said, a genuine concern for border area stability, but more so also the result of domestic nationalist sentiment within China, which has really agitated for a stronger government reaction. As a rising power, China needs, internally as well as externally, to be seen to be prepared to take military action when necessary, particularly when Chinese netizens get on the case. One Chinese general was quoted as saying, "The PLA is the largest standing army in the world, but it is yet to be officially deployed abroad. If it shrinks from intervening in an area like Kokang, right on China's doorstep, it will undermine its international credibility." Military intervention in Kokang would have actually allowed China's special forces to flex their muscles and would have actually been a nice precedent to set in terms of preparing for any possible future conflicts in what is a familiar territory for the Chinese. In March, the chief of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, Feng Hui, visited Yunnan and requested that the Chengdu military region and its special forces research the possibility of intervening in Kokang. This is according to Chinese press reports. So this was very serious indeed. State media in late March broadcast nighttime live fire drills designed to assess the combat readiness of the PLA's 14th Army Corps. And again, I think that Peng was very instrumental and very astute in broadcasting and playing on actual Beijing's fears that somehow the Tatmadaw's actions were linked to U.S. strategic interests in the region. And I don't think there is any credibility to that argument, but it's something which resonates deeply in the distrust among some Chinese about the improvement in U.S.-Myanmar relations. I mean, ultimately, I think linkages between what is a very localized border conflict with a unique history and dynamics, and a broader regional geopolitical picture is quite tenuous, and I think serves propaganda and serves certainly Peng Xiaoxing and works on fears in Beijing, but is certainly not the case. I think the Tatmadaw's calculation was more to do with internal security dynamics and consolidating its power in the border areas. I mean, it's quite clear that center-periphery conflict in Myanmar has always, to some extent or another, been externally sustained. Since independence, successive central governments have fought off the never-defeated armed insurgencies, and this was actually the premise for the military's takeover in 1962. The Kokang conflict is no different. If you look at the history of the Kokang region, it was only really ceded to the British in 1897 under the Beijing Convention. At that time, Yunnan was not fully controlled by the emperor in Beijing, but neither did it actually have allegiance to the Burmese king prior to the Anglo-Burmese Wars. It essentially paid informal tribute to the Shan princes, or the Saofas. And the trade of the Kokang was heavily reliant on flows that went westwards towards the Shan State, and so I think historically they were more linked to Burma than they were to China, though ethnically they were more Chinese. I mean, under British colonial rule, it was hardly direct colonial rule at all. It was, the entire region was known as non-ministerial Burma, and there was a loose system of allegiances between local princes and the administrators and the central government. Once Myanmar became independent, it wasn't more successful than the British colonials at actually getting the Kokang under centralized control. In 1949, a defeated Kuomintang party, which the majority of whom went to Taiwan, an unfortunate but significant minority actually landed in the Shan State and sought refuge in the Shan State, and actually received backing from Thailand and the United States to establish military bases and trafficked opium to finance its raids into China. Almost the entire territory that we're now talking about, the Kokang and the Wa and the Mongla, were held under Kuomintang forces, so was not under Central Burmese control whatsoever. I mean, following the collapse of the KMT forces in 1961, other groups filled the vacuum, notably the China-backed Burma Communist Party, and the creation of the Kokang itself dates back to the collapse of the BCP, the Burma Communist Party, in 1989. By that time, cross-border trade had reached an estimated $3 billion and was essentially constituted 40% of Myanmar's GDP, all in the hands of those who controlled border trade, essentially, which wasn't the Central Burmese government. So, in one sense, there is this real heated history of friction between China and Myanmar, and not only between China and Myanmar, but in terms of China's influence and role in the civil war which raged under Myanmar. Or in Myanmar. But Beijing played a pivotal role in turning this picture around. In the 1980s, under Deng Xiaoping's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, support shifted towards the central government. The Chinese interest was primarily in securing full access to Myanmar's economy and lucrative natural resources, which required strong government-to-government relations and stability, actually, in the border areas. The Tatmadaw, or the Burmese military, which was in power at the time, skillfully used this post-Cold War reorientation in its favor. From 1988 to 2010, the Tatmadaw directed the economy eastwards. China rapidly emerged as the largest foreign investor, predominantly through infrastructure projects, hydroelectric power generation, and agro-industry. Exports in that period rose from $167 million to $8.7 billion. And foreign investment from $4 million to $8.3 billion. And China was central to all this, and central to the success, the economic success, I would argue, of the Myanmar regime. And I think this goes to the heart of why it's too simplistic to assume that the political transition in 2011 was a reaction against Chinese influence, or in fact some sense of impending endgame scenario for the Burmese government in terms of an Arab Spring. Chinese influence did not suddenly escalate to intolerable levels, and it's clear that the military was and continues to be acting out of a position of strength, not weakness. It is still the key arbitrator of Myanmar's political and security dynamics. And as the Myanmar military doubled in size, it had managed to sign ceasefires, loose de facto agreements with most of these ethnic armed groups, who were far weaker than they were in their heyday, and that's including the Kokang. So the 4 armed groups that form the remnants of the BCP and with which China has the closest ties to this day, it's undeniable that those links exist, but within the overall importance of Beijing's relationship with Naypyidaw are increasingly insignificant. For China, regardless of these past linkages, keeping things cordial with Myanmar's armed forces helps prevent the border areas and the border issues from being internationalized, which I think is its biggest fear. Xi Jinping himself, I think it's always wise to look at his pronouncements on the issue. And despite heated pronouncements by the PLA and by even Li Keqiang, the only thing that Xi Jinping has said about this incident was that it was a complicated problem which requires a complicated solution. So he didn't take a concrete stand on the issue. I mean, in the bigger picture, Myanmar is key to President Xi's periphery diplomacy and hosts many of China's prized infrastructure and connectivity projects. These include $3 billion twin oil and gas pipelines from Kunming to Kyokpyu, which at maximum capacity source 28% of China's gas imports from the Indian Ocean directly to its interior. There's also a special economic zone and deep-sea port being built at Kyokpyu, which would reduce Beijing's trade dependence on the Straits of Malacca, which it sees as being far too much in the hands of the US and its allies. And there's overland access to India through the Michina-Pangso Pass. All of these cross-border projects pass or are very close to the Kokang region. That pass would cut existing transportation costs between Asia's two largest economies by 30%. So these investments are all central to Beijing's One Belt, One Road strategy, encompassing both the maritime and overland routes that it seeks to build as part of its 21st century Silk Road project. And for its part, I think the Myanmar authorities are quite comfortable with the arrangements. I mean, despite the fact that I think we've made much of the fact that they have sought to rebalance their relationship with the West, it's clear that even despite the fact that the Myanmar military has opened defense ties with the United States, with India, with Australia, Naypyidaw's ambition is to transform the military into a more internationally respectable institution. But it's still within the context of its non-aligned foreign policy. I mean, this is central. And Naypyidaw has stressed that the widening of its foreign policy and defense partners will not result in the prioritization of any specific future security alignments. In particular, Myanmar's political military leadership will have reservations to this day about the reliability of deepening US overtures at a strategic level. So I just don't see this as being a mutually exclusive relationship. There is an elite political consensus that it is in the interest of Myanmar to maintain strong ties with Beijing, and I think we saw this in the way in which the Kokang incident was resolved. On the 2nd of April, the government sent a mission to Beijing and formally apologized for the incursion into Chinese territory, and has promised to make reparations. On March 15th, earlier last month, the head of the PLA had called on Myanmar to severely punish the perpetrators as well as apologize and compensate the families of the victims. Now, this was strong language, but I think it also was an olive branch in a sense, giving the conditions for which under which China would agree to resume relations as normal. And this was not, this opportunity was seized on by Min Aung Hlaing, and he sent one of his chief aides, Aung Thang Tut, who is the chief of the Bureau of Special Operations 2, which covers both the Shan and Karenni states, and was a position that Min Aung Hlaing had in 2009, to deliver a letter by Min Aung Hlaing in which he apologized for the incursion into Chinese territory. And strangely enough, accompanied with him was Wuna Maung Luin, who is the Myanmar foreign minister. But this wasn't about government-to-government relations. This was about military-to-military relations. This was about reconciling ties, and it seems to have worked. Feng spoke highly of the visit and acknowledged the sincerity of the Myanmar side to deal with the incident in the proper way, quote unquote. So I think, if anything, the developments have helped the military send the message to ethnic armed groups that it no longer serves to play Beijing and Naypyidaw against each other. And that, I think, also explains the restraint by the United Wa State Army, who is the closest ally of the Kokang in terms of ethnic groups, far larger, far more powerful, but has played actually a very minimal role in this process. The Kokang are ostracized domestically. They're not part of the national ceasefire process. They weren't included in the draft national ceasefire text signed on the 30th of March. And we can be reasonably certain that Beijing is probably still after some form of status quo ante, which is loose ceasefire capitalism. But really, Peng's actions have backfired and have probably hastened in the long term a loss of support. By presenting themselves as a source of the problem, ethnic groups are depleting the remaining political capital in China towards their cause. So I think to wrap up, because I think I've gone over time already, after 6 decades of internal armed conflict, Myanmar's civil war might end, not through a grand political bargain, but because it gradually becomes unsustainable. Insurgency in Southeast Asia is becoming increasingly anachronistic as regional economic and political developments turn previously remote border areas into frontiers of connectivity between larger neighbors. And the ability of ethnic armed groups to operate with implicit government backing or by playing one government against another is limited and certainly doomed to decline in the long run. Regardless of who constitutes the next government, Myanmar's leaders are likely to continue to pursue multiple foreign policy avenues to manage the complex mix of security pressures confronting it. But if the Kokang incident is any indication whatsoever, it's that the military's vision on foreign policy and border affairs is still paramount, and that China continues to play a very vital role in this overall picture of state building. Thanks.
Thank you, Hervé. So, a complicated problem with perhaps no solution, no easy solution. But I think what you've argued is that it's one that's not going to get in the way of the grander scheme of things as things move forward in Myanmar. But perhaps there are different opinions on that, and I'm going to open it up straight away for questions, points. Please let us know who you are when I call on you. So,
I'm Mahmoud Ali, member of the Institute of Chinese-US Relations. Thank you for sharing your insights. Fascinating. One's impression is that China is an authoritarian state. It controls everything. Everything is well managed, and Beijing certainly knows who is where, doing what. How is Peng allowed to maintain a militia that's armed, trained, and able to cross internationally recognized borders and invade a friendly country? Is he a tool of leverage, or is he a loose cannon, just lurking in the sort of orifices of the Chinese state, lost, nobody knows? I mean, how do you explain that?
No. I mean, I think he's a historic tool of leverage. He's certainly, I don't mean to sound ageist, but he's certainly a bit of a historic fossil in terms of his linkages to the Burma Communist Party and his plans to resume control of the Kokang region. But he's a loose cannon. I think that's what it is. He's a loose cannon that is bothersome and awkward to Beijing. That is my reading of the situation. I know that others will have a different impression. There is some form of implicit support towards the Kokang. There's a great deal of sympathy in China, and particularly in Yunnan province, for the border groups. But in the longer sort of view of things, it's simply not within. There's too much at stake within the bilateral relationship to put all your eggs in the basket of Peng Xiaoxing. And I think that is the sort of fundamental lesson of for him. I mean, his experiment has backfired. It's probably was a last ditch effort to regain some kind of lost glory, and it was intent or designed to create some division between the Chinese and the Burmese side, in which he could then operate in the vacuum in the middle like the good old days. But ultimately, I don't think it has worked for him.
I'm Simon from Lucy. Thank you very much for sharing your thought. You mentioned that the Crimea scenario in terms of Kokang incident is less likely. But technically, it is still possible that just like Putin insisted that the interest of ethnic Russia is important in Crimea, China may extend the assertion of the need for protecting our interests Chinese ethnic minorities such as Kokang. And besides that, there are a lot of ethnic Chinese groups exist in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thai. So China's national power increases I think China is more technically possible today to demand the need for protecting the interests of ethnic Chinese overseas. And just like Premier Li Keqiang expressed his anger at, to Myanmar and large giftings, and need to protect the territorial integrity. It's in terms of domestic part of China, not overseas China, but still technically possible to extend it overseas. I'd like to share your opinion about this.
I think that there's certainly far more players involved in since 2011, and but it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. So there's a reading that somehow Myanmar ought to be in one camp or another, or that's simply because it accepts Japanese economic incentives or concessions, and that they are building the Tilawa Special Economic Zone, or that India has made overtures and is building canals in the Arakan state, doesn't mean that it shouldn't prioritize its relationship with what remains its largest and I think most important neighbor, and that's China. So I think we are in danger of misreading what's happening in Myanmar by viewing it too simply in terms of either-or scenario. I think that clearly the transition and even the geopolitics in the region have created a lot of opportunity for the Burmese government to exploit and for its own good. And why not get more foreign investors? Why not open ties to various militaries? Why not seek to boost international credibility? That aligns perfectly with its vision of sort of a non-aligned defense and foreign policy. But China really does play a very unique role. It's the only one that shares such a long and complicated border, and it's still pivotal in China's cooperation is still pivotal if it wants to essentially come to a comprehensive political settlement with the ethnic armed groups in favor of the central government, and for that China will be required. And I think China ultimately will be instrumental because its relations with the central government for all these various projects and in terms of its own credibility and reputation abroad is absolutely essential. Myanmar figures as a huge priority in China's periphery diplomacy.
Thank you. Yes, Sam.
Hi, Tom Crofts from the Foreign Office. Hervé, thank you for that really useful overview. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the internal politics to all of this, because you said that the Tatmadaw offensive against the Kokang was very popular. I just wondered if that was kind of universally so or exclusively among the kind of ethnic Burmans, because there was some suggestion early on that some of the other ethnic armed groups provided support to the Kokang at an early stage, although that seemed to kind of die down quite quickly.
I think so. It's clear that in terms of the social media outpouring of support for the Tatmadaw, that was in the Burmese language and was predominantly with ethnic Burmans, and you could argue that perhaps they were already supportive of the Tatmadaw, but obviously it has a very controversial image even within Myanmar. The ethnic groups were more ambivalent about what was happening. I don't think they were as happy to see what was happening in the Kokang, or as supportive of the Tatmadaw's initiatives. On the other hand, I think they really played a very muted role in all this. There was never a public pronouncement that somehow, for example, the talks on the ceasefire, the national ceasefire accord, should be halted as a result of fighting on the border area. They were quite happy to proceed with the signing of the National Ceasefire Accord draft statement on the 30th of March, 15 days after the bombing across on the Chinese side, and after 60,000 had fled into Yunnan province. So I think it leaves a picture of the Kokang being rather ostracized. Now, people have made much of the fact that, or analysts have made much of the fact that there seems to be some collusion between the Kokang and other ethnic groups, and there's the TNLA there's the Arakan, there are elements of the KIA, but I think that this is very small in the overall picture of things, and the elephant in the room are the Wa, because that's by far the largest ethnic group, 30,000 strong. They share the strongest links with the Kokang, and would have most at stake in terms of defending Peng Xiaoxing. And if they have supported him, it would have been covertly, and that in itself is a statement that they didn't want to rock the boat, and that they were still quite happy to sign and be part of the national ceasefire coordination team, and sign this national ceasefire accord draft text on the 30th of March. So the fact that the Wa, the largest of all the elephants of the ethnic armed groups, didn't come to the aid of Peng Xiaoxing, to me really is quite revealing of the extent to which he is very isolated ultimately, and that helps, of course, in the military's depiction of Peng Xiaoxing as being sort of a renegade, illegitimate rebel, as opposed to one of the legitimate ones who was sat around the negotiating table. Now, he himself has tried to boost his legitimacy and asked if he could attend these ceasefire talks, but obviously that would give him the concession of being the sort of rightful leader in charge of the Kokang, which is certainly not the impression that the Tatmadaw or President Thein Sein want to give. So my impression is that the Kokang are tried in a high-stakes game to go for a very risky last-ditch effort, and it has significantly backfired, both domestically within Myanmar and also in terms of not getting sufficient support from Beijing.
Jan.
Jens Warner from the ISS. First, I just like to add a bit to this previous question and the question of my own. You mentioned the Commander-in-Chief said any group who supports the Kokang will pay, and they did accuse the Wa and the Monga of that, of such covert support. And in the meantime, they signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement with the other groups. Now, the leaders of the groups that signed this agreement, they will have a conference to approve it, or hopefully approve it, on the 1st of May. And this will be held in Wa territory, which is actually seen as a rebuke to the military, and perhaps also representing a wish for the Kokang to actually be included in the ceasefire talks by these other groups. Now for my question, you mentioned the military links. I saw recently there's a representative of the USDP, the military ruling party. He recently described a three-layered relations with China as first, people to people, second, party to party, and thirdly, government to government. So I was wondering how important do you think this party to party aspect of the relationship really is, or is it just a sort of attempt by this USDP person to claim some credibility on the foreign policy, perhaps?
Yeah.
I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi has visited China, so it's clear that Beijing is preparing for a possible change in government in the November election.
I mean, very good points. I think there's a saying in China that the party controls the direction of the gun, and it's something that they often like to repeat, in the sense that the party controls the PLA. And I think the same can't really be said in Myanmar. If anything, it's the Tatmadaw controls the direction of the party, which is the United States, the Union Solidarity and Development Party. And I think the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which is currently the party with the most seats in Parliament, isn't necessarily going to retain its privileged position of a supermajority. And it probably makes sense that they try to beef up its credentials as being sort of the equivalent of the party in China. But there's no way that that's going to happen, not under this sort of semi-democratic framework. I mean, as to the nature of the bilateral ties, it's clear that it's more than just military to military. It's more than simply President Thein Sein to President Xi Jinping. Although on that note, I mean, he has been to China more often. President Thein Sein has been to China more often than any other country. And as much as we like to make of the fact that he's been to the US and that he has normalized ties, he's been to China 5 times and has seen Xi Jinping in bilaterals more often than he has seen Aung San Suu Kyi in bilaterals. So it gives you a sense of the prioritization of that relationship, and that continues. Aung San Suu Kyi herself, who may be preparing or who hopes to be preparing to be taking on the reins of power after 2015, has also made overtures to the Chinese. She was very influential in a decision by a special parliamentary group looking into allegations of abuse in the Lepidong copper mine, which is a very significant investment in Myanmar, Chinese-led investment, and actually sided on behalf of the foreign investors and said that we actually, as a country, need to grow to respect our relationships with foreign investors, otherwise we scare them off. But more to the point, she has made made significant efforts to try to rekindle or actually just fabricate some sense of a good relationship with Beijing, and Beijing has played it very carefully. They've never extended an official invitation for her. Why would they? She's a member of parliament as it stands, and it risks insulting the military as well as President Thein Sein. Hierarchy and status is a very big thing in that world, but there are signs that under, for example, Ambassador Yang Hulang's tenure in the country, that the Chinese have done a lot more to seek to diversify their relationships with civilian politicians as well as civil society actors, the 88 group of student activists, because they're hedging their bets for what might arrive post-2015. The worst scenario for China would be a new government which completely changes course and in fact risks worsening ties than they already are. But I don't think that will be the case. I think there is a general elite consensus, despite concerns of Chinese investments, and in fact, despite, a wave of Burmese nationalist sentiment, which is quite xenophobic at times. There is kind of a very calculated elite consensus that China is required, and some degree of good relationship with your largest neighbor will be required. And on top of that, the military, regardless of post-election outcomes, stands to continue shaping a policy on border affairs and shaping sort of the Myanmar self-perceived image in the world. So I don't think that the Myanmar military itself has changed its views on China at all over the course of 5 years. Yeah.
Hervé, of course, we're not in the forecasting business at the ISS, but would you like just to talk a little bit about the elections in terms of, not necessarily speculating, but what's at stake for the various players, how the situation could change after the election domestically?
This could go on for another few hours. Well, in fact, there's an excellent conference coming up at the London School of Economics. Jürgen Hacke is in the room, Professor Jürgen, and I think that will be discussed at length. So that will probably be a better opportunity to listen and learn from other experts than myself. But my own humble take, and I think this is at this point there's too much guessing work involved. So. But you can be reasonably certain about a few things, and that is that the 2008 constitution isn't necessarily going to change radically, that as it stands it very much limits the options for civilian politicians and in particular the pro-democracy opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi. She may well gain, and she stands to gain much more seats in Parliament, but at the moment she's barred from assuming the presidency. Will we see some kind of coalition arrangement between a USDP and NLD-led government, a government of national unity? It may be possible. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. Will we see something far more heated and confrontational? So far the mood in Parliament has actually been very cordial and collegial, even between parties, and Suu Kyi has mended her ties with Shui Man, who is the leader of the lower house and one of the most powerful figures in the USDP, and both have presidential ambitions. So how that plays out is going to be very interesting. President Thein Sein may or may not have some view for reapplying his candidacy for president for another term. It remains to be seen whether he has or commands sufficient leverage within his own party because actually the big divide isn't so much between Aung San Suu Kyi and the USDP, it's within the USDP, and in particular between Shui Man, who occupies this very powerful position in parliament, and Thein Sein, who's been the president for the last 5 years. And personality politics plays a major role in all that. So there is a significant uncertainty, which also highlights the fact that the military under Min Aung Hlaing is going to maintain this role as being sort of the guardians of national stability, both in the borders as well as internally. And they see themselves as key political arbitrators to make sure that the house is stabilized. And what role they play in 2015 will be interesting as well. The military is able to appoint 25% of the seats in parliament. It nominates directly the Minister of Home Affairs, of Defense, and of Border Affairs, and it occupies a majority of seats. Generals as well as appointments by generals occupy the majority of seats in the National Security and Defense Council. I believe that's what it's called. So I think its reign on power through overt and covert means is still very much intact and isn't going to go away. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Just if you could update us on the Midsummer Dam, is there any distinction between the official explanation and what actually triggered its suspension, and any prospects for the future?
I think the prospects, if you're Chinese, are good because it's been suspended, but it hasn't been cancelled, and it was quite clear that I think President Thein Sein, who was new into office, wanted to make some kind of big gesture that would show that he commanded the sympathies of or knew or was aware of the sympathies of people. There were significant environmental concerns around the dam, and politically very controversial because the majority of the energy generated by this dam, were it to be built, would be flowing to China and not to Myanmar. So there were domestic issues, and he was able to capitalize on that opportunity by suspending it. The Chinese weren't very happy, but the West certainly took it as a sign that he was sort of repivoting away from China and towards the West. If you look at pronouncements made by Shui Man, so the sort of lead rival within the same party, he has been far more sympathetic towards the idea of reopening discussions about getting this dam going. And so I think there's been sort of quite intense lobbying behind the scenes to somehow see this dam re-emerge as a project. And I don't think we've seen the end of it. But in any case, I mean, China has multi-million-dollar investments for several dams along the Salween River, and that's what is often goes unnoticed. So it has huge investments which have been left intact and actually have been actively prioritized by the government. So I think Mitsoni was a bit of a red herring in many ways.
Thank you. Any other points? Yeah, sure.
Just going back to Pen Jiasheng, I just wondered, his motivation for sort of this offensive, was it just criminal, or was there a political dimension to this? And what does it say more widely about the prospects for warlordism more generally?
Actually, before I have a couple of other pictures. These pictures are not from the most recent conflict. They are from 2002. I unearthed them in archives, well, in my own collection. I hadn't seen them in years, and I realized that actually the man on your left there, or the man on the left, is Peng Jiaxing, surrounded by military generals in happier days when they weren't fighting, but destroying drugs, which they were destroying opium, which was the biggest source of livelihood for maintaining this warlord lifestyle. And at the time, this was an era in the 1990s known as ceasefire capitalism, when there was sort of a de facto arrangement between the military, the Burmese military on the one hand, and several of these ethnic groups who are not democratic by any means, but run by these warlords, although he's very charismatic. That ceasefire capitalism is at an end, I think, or if it's not at an end, it's significantly reformed in favor of the Tatmadaw. And the smaller you are, the weaker you are, the more you stand a chance of actually being militarily subjugated. The stronger you are, the more you stand the chance of actually being considered seriously as a player and the negotiating table. In any case, there seems to be a real drive to incorporate ethnic groups into a structured, into the 2008 constitutional framework. Sure, there's discussion about reforming the constitution, but really this is about who controls the arms, who controls the cross-border trade, who controls the territory. And I think that sort of high point of warlordism, when things were going well, because the relations between Myanmar and China were well, and they turned a blind eye towards the border areas, and things were actually quite sort of collegial and friendly between the generals and Peng Xiaoxing and others. Those days are gone. And this also explains why stronger players like the Wa are playing a far more careful and sensitive game than they might have in the 1990s and 2000s. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I personally feel very educated after listening to Hervé on that. Just to alert you to a few things that the ISS is doing related to this part of the world, to Asia. Because at this time of year, we're always building up to our annual Shangri-La dialogue taking place in Singapore, which brings together defense ministers and military chiefs from the whole of the Asian region. And related to that, we'll be publishing the second strategic dossier on Asian militaries. We published the first one last year, and the second one will come out again just before the dialogue. And also this year we're publishing a new publication called the Armed Conflict Survey, which will be looking at conflicts all around the world, no doubt, including this one. So do look out for that. Thanks very much for coming, and in particular thanks to Hervé for a really interesting talk.